skill effect duration can be a bit of a problematic stat in Path of Exile, which is why in Path of Exile 1, access to that stat on the passive skill tree is extremely limited. It's pretty hard to get a very large amount of it. Now, in Path of Exile 2, as it currently stands, that's a completely different story, because there is so much increased skill effect duration all over the tree. So, over here, we've got one wheel for 10, 20, 40% increased skill effect duration. That's a protraction wheel. Then we've got another wheel here for 10, 20, 45% increased skill effect duration, Tides of Change. And then further up, there's another node here for 20%. And there's another wheel here for another 10, 20, 40% increased skill effect duration. That's on the Chronomancy wheel. And then there's also another wheel here with some chaos damage and skill effect duration. And right up here, there's another one, 10, 20, 45% increased skill effect duration on the Preservation wheel. So, with just those 5 wheels that I just discussed, that's this one here, this one here, this one, and this one. Together, these are combined for 190% increased skill effect duration. That's a lot. Some skills are completely broken by this stat, and one of those skills is Time Freeze. So Time Freeze is an ability that comes on the Chronomancer Ascendancy, and what it does is it's basically this huge area of effect around you is frozen when you use this skill, and any monsters that are in that radius basically have their time frozen. They are in a sort of stun-like effect. It's not considered to be a stun or a freeze in terms of like ailments and things like that. This is a separate effect, but the boss is essentially stunned for the duration of the time freeze. Now, time freeze has a base duration of 3 seconds, but as I'm about to get to, this can be completely broken by skill effect duration, other things that affect this. So, one of the other places you can get skill effect duration, and you can get this on any character, is on duels. You can actually roll up to 15% increased skill effect duration on a normal duel. And let's just say, for example, you had all 5 of these wheels that we just discussed for 190% increased skill effect duration, and then you had 5 duel slots, each for 15% increased skill effect duration, for a total 265% increased skill effect duration. Now, that would bring the 3-second time freeze up to 10.95 seconds. So the boss would be stunned for almost 11 seconds whenever you use time freeze. That's pretty good, but there's more as well, because there's also the persistent support for 40% more skill effect duration, which is a multiplier on top of all of the increases and things that you have. So it would be 10.95 seconds multiplied by 1.4 for 15.33 second time freeze. Again, that is ridiculous. Stunning a boss for 15 seconds, that's plenty of time for you to be able to blow it up with whatever damage you're using, whatever skills you're using to blow it up, that's completely fine. But we're not going to stop there, because there's even more. You see, because Time Freeze is a debuff that is applied to all of the monsters in the radius, which means that it's affected by Temporal Chains. Now, Temporal Chains is a curse, and what it does is it kind of slows monsters down and things like that, but one of the other effects that it has is that it slows the expiry rate of persistent effects on the target that it's affecting. The baseline slower expiry rate is 25%, but you can boost this up with increased curse effect. Now, up here, there's a wheel here for some increased curse effect. You've got 6% on each of these small nodes, plus 18% here on the big node, for a total of 36% increased curse effect. And then you've also got 10% curse effect coming from the quality stat on Temporal Chains, and another 25% increased curse effect from the heightened curse support. Now, together, that combines for 71% increased curse effect, which would bring the slower expiry rate modifier up to 43% slower expiry rate of persistent effects, which would mean a 15.33 second time freeze would go up to 26.89 seconds as long as the curse is active on the target for the full duration of that time freeze. So 26, almost 27 second time freeze on the target. That's completely and utterly bonkers. You're verging into sort of completely broken territory at that point. Now, Time Freeze has an interesting line on it. It says, affected enemies have Time Freeze duration halved for each time they've been time frozen in the past 30 seconds. And this modifier was specifically put on this skill with the intention of stopping party play from permanently freezing bosses. Now, the interesting thing here, and I haven't actually tested this, is I'm not sure whether this means when the target actually gets frozen, the moment the skill's cast, that counts as when they were frozen, or if it's a persistent thing that tracks the entire time that they're frozen. So that if they were frozen within the past 30 seconds, this would apply. If it happens at the beginning of that cast, so for example, you cast Time Freeze, and that's the indicated time when the monster was frozen, and then it counts 30 seconds from that period onwards, you can potentially almost permanently time freeze a boss using this setup that I've just discussed here, because the character that specs into Time Freeze can also go down the right-hand side of the tree and grab Time Snap. A Time Snap is a skill which completely resets the cooldowns of all of your other skills when you use it. And when this skill gets to level 20, it has a 32.4 second cooldown. Now, it also has increased cooldown recovery rate from quality if you want to apply that there, and you also gain 6% increased CDR here on the small nodes. So that's a total of 22% increased cooldown recovery rate, and that would bring the cooldown of this skill at level 20 down to 26.5 seconds. Which means that you can actually permanently time freeze a boss, almost permanently time freeze a boss, if you time it correctly, as long as this line here counts as when the target was actually frozen, which, as I said, I haven't tested this, I'm not sure if that's exactly how it works, but that's definitely a possibility there. You may be able to almost permanently time freeze a boss, which is quite interesting. Something else that I want to mention in this video, because it's kind of to do with, duration, increased duration stacking and things like that, is another tech that you could utilize in a build like this, and this has to do with long duration skills and limit skills in particular, and Archmage support. Now, obviously, Archmage is completely broken right now. It's likely to be completely nuked from orbit in January whenever GGG come around to doing a big balance patch. I think Archmage is going to get completely gutted. But one of the things that you can do with Archmage that is really interesting that you couldn't do in PoE1 is support skills that have kind of long durations. In PoE1, there was a time when duration-based skills were the absolute king of builds to be used with Archmage. Things like Cremation, for example, were really, really popular with Archmage because the idea there was that you could use the skill once, you could pay that large mana cost once, and you would benefit from that damage. It would kind of snapshot the damage for the entire duration of the skill. And then, over time, GGG kind of filtered out those duration abilities, and they applied an orb tag to many of them. Things like Cremation and Orb of Storms and things like that, they all had an orb tag applied to them, and Archmage had the line that it could no longer support orb skills. So that was kind of how they broke away from those duration-based abilities with Archmage. But in PoE2, Archmage doesn't have any kind of limit on it in that regard. So you can use it to increase the damage, or I should say add extra damage on top of the damage that you've got for duration-based skills. And there are some really long duration skills in PoE2, and most of them have a limit on them, so that you can only use a certain amount of them. So for example, there is Firestorm, right? Firestorm lasts for 6 seconds as a base duration, but it's limited to 1. You can only use one of these. If you use it again, it will replace the old one immediately. You also have Solar Orb there, which is a 10-second duration, again limited to 1. And that one just kind of creates an area effect ability that pulses every 1.4 seconds and deals some damage. And there's also Orb of Storms, which, similarly to Solar Orb there, also lasts 10 seconds. This one also fires a bolt every interval of 2.95 seconds. But the interesting thing about Orb of Storms is that it also interacts with what you're doing. You can stand in it and use lightning skills. For example, you could cast Spark while you're standing in Orb of Storms, and it would also trigger off that same bolt that gets fired at an interval, and there's a line there that says orb disappears after 29 bolts. That actually scales up with levels, so you can fire off more bolts in total before it actually dissipates. So all of these skills have a long base duration, but they're kind of limited by the fact that you can only have a limit of one of each of them out at one time. But there is a support gem, Overabundance, which allows you to have an additional one, and you can obviously only use one of those, but you can put that on one of those skills and it will now have 2 limit. And that has a 50% less skill effect duration, but of course, if you're using this with all of the previous duration stuff that we discussed, that's not going to be a problem at all. You're still probably going to have around 15 seconds duration on one of those 10-second duration abilities. But the really crazy thing with this kind of duration stacking tech here is a unique item. The Idol of Uldern, which is an amulet that grants +1 to the limit of skills. And this thing just tags every single limit skill. So if you're using let's say you're using all 3 of these limit skills, all of them will suddenly have a limit of 2 instead of 1. And then you can also add an extra one with overabundance, so one of them will have 3 limit. Now, this starts to get a bit ridiculous when you factor in Archmage and all of that extra damage you get from Archmage, because it means that you can lay down each of these abilities one after the other on top of a boss, and the damage will just persist and keep dealing damage over and over again, and it will be affected by Archmage because you had Archmage active when you casted that skill, so all of that extra damage will persist for the entire duration. And you know, if you were using this with the interaction that we just discussed with Time Freeze, the boss would just be completely frozen, and you can just drop all of this duration-based stuff. And then once you're done and all of these skills are up, they're going to be up there for a long, long time because the duration is going to be very long on all of them. And then you can cast Spark, for example, in all of those Orb of Storms, and, you know, they'll all be proccing off every time you use Spark. Crazy thing about Spark is that this one also scales with duration. And if you had, you know, the kind of duration scaling that we talked about earlier, you probably have around a 7-second duration Spark, which is absolutely ridiculous. And Spark is kind of crazy, especially in closed-off areas, bouncing all over the arena. And those Spark projectiles, they just persist and fly all over the arena until they either dissipate or hit a target. So if you're able to just cast them and fire loads of them off, and they've got a huge duration, eventually the boss is going to be taking more and more damage because those projectiles persist until they hit something and then they disappear. But yeah, that's pretty much it, guys. At the moment, I'm just kind of leveling this character right now. I'm just leveling with some minion stuff. If you guys didn't know, you can't migrate right now. I'm not sure what's going on with that. Like, the migration feature is broken. You can click on it and you can kind of get some kind of interaction there. But once you actually try to migrate from solo self-found to trade, there's just nothing happening. It doesn't work. So I've been playing solo self-found, and all of my currency is just like stuck in the solo self-found. And I wanted to play Trade League so I could, you know, purchase the amulet and actually try and do something with this build idea here. But right now I'm kind of doing a fresh start in Trade League because all of my stuff is locked in solo self-found, but that's how it goes.